This is All Up Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. I think it's fair to say that this wasn't the year that Boris Johnson expected when he won that election back in December, with his handling of the pandemic under intense scrutiny, questions over his approach to the Brexit negotiations and, of course, within the past few weeks, Labour overtaking the Conservatives in the polls for the first time during his premiership. But with this week's positive news about a potential COVID-19 vaccine and positive noises about the chances of a Brexit trade deal, could things finally be turning a corner for the Prime Minister? Well, to discuss this, we're joined now by Anita Boateng, a former Conservative Special Advisor, now Senior Director at the PR firm FTI Consulting, and Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at The Observer, a former Senior Policy Advisor to Ed Miliband. Thanks both for being with us. Anita, to you first. It's been perhaps a more challenging year than Boris Johnson expected when he won that majority back in December. How difficult do you think the Prime Minister has found things?
I think every Prime Minister and every leader in every country has found it enormously difficult. But you're right, if you look at what the government was hoping to achieve in its first year, in its first 100 days, this was not the scenario that anyone has envisaged. And I certainly think that a campaigning government that was really about delivering on its promises and looking ahead to the 2024 general election has found this particularly bumpy. And you're absolutely right too, that there is light now at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, it's interesting to say about this light at the end of the tunnel. And Sonia, if we take it as read that it's been a difficult year for the Prime Minister, do you think that things could finally be about to get a bit easier for him?
I do think the vaccine's absolutely brilliant news. The fact that it may be imminent and scientists are feeling so positive about it. I do, however, think there are big logistical challenges in making sure it gets out there. Not as big as with the test and trace scheme. I think it's going to be harder for the government to mess this up than test and trace. But I do think there are still logistical challenges around it. I think scientists have been really keen to stress it's not going to be like life is getting back to normal from anything like January onwards. It's going to be a gradual rollout of the vaccine, so there are still likely to be some social restrictions in place for quite some time yet, and I think the government's going to have to manage all of that. And then, Sophie, you mentioned Brexit, and I think whatever happens with Brexit, I think the fact that we've got a Biden presidency does actually increase the likelihood of some sort of Brexit deal, because I think the Prime Minister will not want to fall on the wrong side of the Americans by undermining the peace process in Northern Ireland. But, the government's own best estimates around Brexit, even a bare bones free trade deal, which is essentially the best we can hope for at this stage, will have a huge impact in the medium term, according to the government's own projections. More economists think than coronavirus, the pandemic, will have in the medium term. So the vaccine is great news. I think we should all be feeling really optimistic about it. We deserve to feel optimistic about it after what's been a very, very difficult few months. But I by no means think that that life is suddenly going to get easy for Boris Johnson. I think we're a very, very long way off a time when it's going to be easy governing of this country.
Yeah, interesting you say that actually it could be that Joe Biden presidency makes a trade deal more likely. We of course know that when he spoke to the Prime Minister, he flagged the importance of the Good Friday Agreement. Anita, how important do you think getting a trade deal is for Boris Johnson? Or do you think that actually he is relatively relaxed either way, and if the conversation gets back onto Brexit, that's good news for him?
I'm not convinced, first of all, that Joe Biden hugely changes a calculation when it comes to the government's preference for a trade deal. I think the fundamentals remain in place. And ultimately, this really is a question about fisheries and whether or not the positive momentum that we've seen over the coming few weeks can continue in order to get that trade deal agreed. I just want to go back to this issue around the vaccine. Just very briefly, I think that definitely there are logistical challenges that remain. But I think the big thing that has changed really is a political opposition that the Prime Minister was facing from his backbenchers. Their primary argument was simply, we cannot continue the way that we are. If there is no light at the end of the tunnel, then ultimately at some point we have to let the economy take precedence, because we could destroy our economy and we could, harm people's mental health and all the other implications of lockdown, waiting for a vaccine that may never come. And that prospect that a vaccine will overcome will make a massive difference to that handling of the backbenchers. And similarly, I think there are backbenchers that have been very concerned about the prospect of there not being a trade deal or an agreement that favours the UK's priorities. And I think that the positive momentum we've seen over the past couple of weeks will help to calm the backbenchers in that way too.
That is interesting, because it does feel as if there had been a growing sense of restlessness among Conservative backbenchers. I wonder, Sonia, if you think that the fact that a vaccine may calm the backbenchers will also be reflected among the rest of the country as well. Do you think that Boris Johnson could see his own popularity ratings go up if there is this light at the end of the tunnel, if things do start to begin to get back to normal, she says with crossed fingers, next year?
I think it's almost inevitable, isn't it? I think if we do get a vaccine and it works and it feels like as a country we're sort of coming out of the darkest times as a pandemic, I think, inevitably people's, the favourability of ratings of the government will go up. I mean, they have been very low. Polling shows that people really are quite disappointed in the government's approach to handling the pandemic, I think justifiably so, when you look at how things have played out with things like test and trace, for example. I think the government have made a number of very serious mistakes that sort of, if it had taken certain actions, it could have held off a second wave a bit longer, and that just didn't happen. So I think trust is low, but I think inevitably it will go up if we get a vaccine, it's effective, and we start to see, life go back to normal, hopefully from kind of next summer or so. Ratings will go up. So I think there'll be a lot of political relief as well as sort of substantive relief in the government, and that's right. Just to come back to this this idea of sort of Brexit and a trade deal, though, I'm somebody who actually thinks, unlike I think Anita, that whether or not we get a trade deal is all about politics. It's all about the extent to which the two sides are willing to compromise. And for the UK government and for Boris Johnson, it's always been the extent to which, to what extent is the UK prepared to accept some degree of regulatory alignment with the EU in order to get access to the single market through a free trade deal. And that has always been the fundamental issue. The stuff on fisheries, it will work itself out if people want to get a deal. And I just think that the Conservatives have placed so much emphasis on a trade deal with the US as sort of making up for the huge loss in trade that would result from a no-deal Brexit. Now, a trade deal with the US can't fully make that up because they're so much further away from us. But I do think that Biden's much harder line on the Good Friday Agreement and the Northern Ireland peace process, and the need for the UK to stand by its commitment that there will not be a border on the island of Ireland, I think that puts heaps extra political pressure on the UK to reach an agreement for a free trade deal with the EU. So that's why I was arguing that I think a Biden presidency does make that more likely, whereas we know Trump was much more...
I'm just going to jump in just because there's one quick thing I'm keen to ask Anita about before we're out of time. I know that you've clearly got very different views when it comes to Brexit and the trade deal. Anita, just to get your thoughts on the reports this morning that Kayne may become the Prime Minister's new Chief of Staff, alumni of Vote Leave. Do you think that's going to go down well with other members of the government, as you yourself used to be until relatively recently?
I think there's two questions here, isn't there? There's the question around what's happening with the communications department. And I think the injection of Allegra into that team as a new government spokesman will make a massive difference to the government's ability to communicate its message. And so I think you probably can afford to kind of lose Lee from the comms team and bring him closer to the centre of government policy making. And I do think that there has been a need to beef up the numbers of people really with, primary access to the Prime Minister, who are at the centre of managing the logistics of running government, which is a huge part of making government work very well. So I think they do need a chief of staff, and I think Lee seems like an appropriate candidate for that.
OK, out of time. Thank you both very much for coming on and assessing the current state of the Premiership for Boris Johnson. Thank you.